She said it without looking at me. That's the detail I keep returning to, even now. She didn't turn, didn't check to see what kind of man she was talking to. She stared straight at the departure board, where our train had just flipped from on time to delayed, 4 hours. And she said it the way you'd say a thing you've already decided on, and are now simply announcing to the universe. I need you to pretend you know me. The board kept blinking. Platform 7, New Haven to Boston. 4:22 departure, now 8:22. The whole platform had exhaled at once when the sign changed. That specific communal groan of strangers who suddenly have 4 hours they didn't plan for, and she had gone completely still in it. The man who just walked through those doors, she said, still not looking at me, is someone I was supposed to never see again, and he's going to come this way, because this is the only platform with seating, and I have been standing in this exact spot for 45 minutes, and I have nowhere to go. I looked toward the doors. A man in a gray overcoat, early 40s, the kind of face that lands differently once you know what she'd said about him. Arranged, controlled, the expression of a man who has rehearsed his own bearing. When I looked back, she had finally turned. Brown eyes, dark circles from what looked like more than one night of not enough sleep. A red winter coat she was gripping shut at the collar, with one hand, even though it was buttoned. She looked at me the way people look at strangers. They are about to trust, past the point where trust makes logical sense, and they know it, and they're doing it anyway. I'm sorry, she said. I know that's a strange thing to ask. It's a strange morning, I said, and I stayed where I was. What I didn't tell her then, what I had no reason to tell a stranger on a train platform, was that I knew something about sitting still when every instinct says move, that I'd spent the better part of 3 years learning it, that the reason I was at New Haven Station on a Wednesday morning with a bag that had been packed and repacked twice was that the life I thought I was building had, 18 months ago, come to a very quiet and total stop, and I was only now getting good at being in the middle of things without knowing how they ended. I'm a wildlife photographer. I spend weeks at a time in places that require patience as a survival skill, waiting for an animal to appear, waiting for light to change, waiting for the moment that only arrives if you're willing to stay exactly where you are, long after it would be easier to leave. What I'd never been good at was bringing that quality of stillness home, into relationships, into the spaces that required it most. My daughter, who was 9 when her mother and I separated, said something to me once that I've turned over so many times since. She said, "You're always really present when you're gone, Dad. But when you're here, you feel like you're about to leave." She said it without accusation, the way kids say the things adults have been carefully not saying. Just an observation, just the truth, dropped in the way of a 9-year-old who hasn't yet learned to soften it. That sentence cost me something. I've been trying to pay it back ever since, mostly by learning to stay. Which is why, when a woman in a red winter coat asked me to sit still and pretend I knew her, I found it required almost no effort at all. His name, I would learn later, was Owen Calloway. They'd been together almost 2 years, ended it 7 months ago, or she had ended it, and he had spent the 7 months since then making very clear that he didn't consider it ended. Not in any alarming way, she would eventually clarify. Just in the way of a man who had reframed her leaving as a problem that hadn't yet been correctly solved, and kept applying solutions. But that was all later. What happened first was this. He crossed the platform toward the seating area, saw her, and stopped. One beat. The kind of stop that tells you something without any of the words. Then he walked over. Nina. His voice had a quality I recognized. The particular smoothness of a man who is performing calm. "I didn't know you were on this train." "Owen," she said. He glanced at me with a look designed to appear casual. "Who's this?" And she said, easily, her hand loosening from her collar, "This is a friend." It was the simplest possible answer. It was also, I understood immediately, what she needed. Not a husband, not a fiancé, not any complex architecture of cover story. Just a friend. Someone who knew her. Someone between her and the math of a woman alone, on a platform with 4 hours and no exit. I put out my hand. "Ben?" He shook it with the grip of a man keeping count of something. "Owen. You know each other from work?" I said to him, the way you would if she was someone you knew and he was someone you didn't. She almost looked at me. Didn't. "A long time ago," she said. Owen stood there for another moment, the specific pause of a man recalculating a situation, and then said he'd gotten a coffee and come back, and left. Nina turned to me. I was watching the departure board. "You're very good at that," she said. "I wait for a living," I said. "It teaches you what to do with your hands." She laughed. Quietly, like she hadn't expected to. What do you mean you wait for a living? Wildlife photography. Most of the job is staying still. She studied me for a second. What? Nothing. Just, you look like someone who could wait. I looked at the board. 7 hours and 38 minutes until Boston. I did the math. You want to get off this platform, I said. There's a diner on Chapel Street, 3 blocks from the station. Owen isn't going to follow you there because he'll convince himself he'd look desperate, and looking desperate is the one thing he's decided not to be. She stared at me. How do you know that? I watched him for 90 seconds, I said. That's usually enough. She picked up her bag. The diner was called Marion's, and it smelled like coffee and griddle, and the specific warmth of a place that has been open since before anyone currently alive in it was born. We took a booth in the back. She ordered tea. I ordered coffee, and the thing on the menu that had the most words in it because I'd been awake since 5. Here is what I learned about Nina Vasquez in the 4 hours our train was delayed. She was 38 years old and taught high school English in Boston, which she had been doing for 12 years and intended to keep doing, even though her mother asked at every family dinner whether she'd considered something with a pension that wasn't public school, which is a concern expressed with love by women who grew up with less security than they wanted. She had a younger brother who was funny and irresponsible, and whom she had bailed out twice in ways she'd never told her parents. She had been to 7 countries, all for the wrong reasons: a relationship, a conference, a friend's destination wedding she'd served as maid of honor for, even though she'd had pneumonia the week before, and had stood at the altar in Tuscany, running a temperature of 101, with a smile she describes as the single greatest acting performance of her life. She had been with Owen for 22 months. He was an emergency room physician, which is a thing I mention only because of what she said about it. He saves lives at work, and so he believes he should have that authority everywhere. Everywhere, including over the ones that don't need saving. I didn't say anything to that. There's a thing you learn waiting in the field, that the animals who've been still the longest often move the most when they finally do. And what they need most in the moment before is the sense that nothing around them is rushing. He never did anything that I could point to, she said. She'd moved on to her second tea. That's the thing that's hardest to explain to people. There were no incidents, no scenes, just this constant management of the temperature of every room we were in together, of my reactions, of my... She stopped. I started explaining myself to him. Every decision, not because he demanded explanations, but because when I didn't, he had a way of looking at me that made me feel like I'd skipped a step. She turned the mug between her palms. After a while, I couldn't remember which thoughts were mine. I had ordered a second coffee without noticing. How long did it take, I said, before you felt like yourself again? She looked at me, not with surprise exactly, but with the attention of someone who expected a different question. About 3 months, she said. For the big things, for the small things, the explaining yourself reflex, longer. I still catch it sometimes. I'll be about to text someone about a decision, and I'll realize I don't need to tell anyone. I can just make it. She shook her head. 3 months for big things, a year for small things. And some things, she paused, some things you don't know the timetable on yet. We sat with that for a moment. Outside the diner window, Chapel Street was doing what streets do on Wednesday mornings. Delivery trucks, 2 college students walking fast, a woman with a stroller who kept shifting it with the practiced single hand of someone who'd been doing it long enough that it required no attention. What about you? Nina said. What about me? You said you were good at waiting. You didn't say what you were waiting on today. I thought about that for a second. My daughter lives in Boston. She's 13 now. I'm going for her fall play. She's playing the lead. Nina smiled, genuinely, not the politeness variety. What's the play? She'll be annoyed if I look it up, so I don't know. Something with a lot of lines, apparently. She called me twice last week to run them. She called you? Yes. She didn't text? No. Nina looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read for a moment. Then she said, my students text everything. The ones who call, they're the ones who actually want you to hear them, not just receive the information. She paused. She called because she wanted you to hear her say the lines. I hadn't thought about it in exactly that way before. It landed somewhere it hadn't been. The train delay reduced to 3.5 hours around noon, then jumped back to 4 at 12:40, when they announced a signal issue outside Providence. We'd stopped checking. At some point, the question of whether we were at the diner or the platform had stopped being about the train, and had become about the booth and the coffee, and the fact that Nina was in the middle of a sentence about a student who had written the single best essay she'd read in 12 years of teaching, and then told her, as an aside, that he hadn't applied to college. I spent 2 weeks fighting for that kid, she said. She'd abandoned the tea, and moved on to water. His parents, the counselor, the principal, 2 weeks. Calling in every favor I had. Getting his essay in front of people. She leaned back. He got in. Full ride. He's a junior now. He sent me a picture last year, him at his graduation, cap and gown, with a note that said, "You were really annoying, Ms. Vasquez. Thank you." I laughed. Actually laughed, the kind you don't plan on. "That's the whole job," she said, still smiling. "Right there. That's all of it. You're very good at it." "I know," she said, without false modesty. It took me a while to be able to say that plainly. For a long time I qualified it. I said I tried to be, or that I hoped I was. But 12 years in, enough students have come back. "I know what I'm doing." She looked at me evenly. "What about you? Are you good at it? The photography? The waiting?" I considered that. I'm better at waiting for animals than I used to be at waiting for people. Getting better at people. That's an honest answer. It's the only kind I have. She studied me for a moment. "Your daughter," she said. "Are you good at waiting for her?" I felt that one sit somewhere in the chest before I answered. "I'm learning to be," I said. "She's teaching me. She doesn't know it, but she is." Nina nodded slowly. We stayed like that for a while, not in the way of two people who've run out of things to say, but in the way of two people who've found the thing worth sitting with and are doing that. The train announcement came at 2:14. Platform 7. Boarding in 20 minutes. We paid the check. She tried to split it. I said she'd had 4 cups of tea and I'd had a full breakfast, and she'd earned both. She didn't fight it, which told me something about how tired she was of fighting things that weren't worth the energy. On the walk back to the station, she said, "I want to tell you something." "Okay." "When I asked you to pretend to know me, I didn't actually need you to do very much. I just needed someone to be standing there, like I wasn't alone." She was quiet for a half block. "But you did something else. You stayed on the platform the whole time Owen was still there, and you made it look like the most natural thing in the world. And I don't know how to explain how much that mattered without it sounding smaller than it was." "You don't have to explain it," I said. "I know. I wanted to anyway." We walked another half block. 12 years of English," I said. "You've taught that to your students." "Taught them what?" "That you don't have to have the exact words. That wanting to say something, badly enough to try, means more than getting it perfectly right." She looked at me sideways. "You're not as quiet as you look," she said. "I know," I said. "My daughter says the same thing." On the train, she sat in the window seat and I sat beside her, and we talked for most of the 2 hours, which is rare, the kind of talking where you stop noticing the time. At some point we passed through Providence, and the signal problem that had held us there was apparently resolved, because we didn't stop. We talked about the difference between solitude and loneliness, about the specific sadness of being in a relationship with someone and still feeling alone, which is a loneliness she said felt different from regular loneliness, because at least with regular loneliness, you know what you're missing. We talked about what it means to choose a profession that asks you to give yourself to it. Teaching, photography, any work that requires your actual attention and not just your hours. We talked about her brother's latest situation, which involved a food truck in Austin and a business partner he'd met at a kickboxing gym, details she laid out with the practiced mix of love and exhaustion of a person who has been the responsible sibling long enough to have stopped being surprised. She asked me about the places I'd been. I told her about a week in Montana, when I'd waited 11 days in a river blind for a wolf pack that finally came through on day 12 at 4 in the morning in a snowstorm, and I'd gotten one photograph that turned out to be the best thing I'd ever made. And by the time I showed it to anyone, I'd been so alone with it for so long that the response felt entirely separate from the making of it. Like the making had been the whole thing, and the showing was just aftermath. She said, "You're describing teaching." I thought about that. "Yes," I said. "Exactly that." She turned to the window. Connecticut giving way to Rhode Island, brown and gold in the early November afternoon. "Do you think you'll get back out there soon?" "Back to the field?" "Probably after Boston," I said. "There's a project in northern Canada. Caribou migration." She nodded. "How long?" 3 weeks, maybe 4. And then? "And then I'm home for a while. I bought a house." I paused. "First one. I've been renting for a long time." She looked at me. "Why now?" The question was quiet. No pressure in it. Just the question. "My daughter said something to me once," I said. "That I was really present when I was gone, but when I was home, I felt like I was about to leave." I looked at the window. I've been trying to earn a different answer to that for a while. Buying the house was part of it. Staying in it will be the harder part. Nina was quiet for a moment. "She's going to be glad you came for the play," she said. "I know. I mean specifically. Not just glad you were there, glad you came, that you traveled for it, that you came all the way to be in the room. She paused. I taught a kid once whose dad came to every school thing he could, drove 4 hours sometimes. The kid pretended not to care, but he wrote about it in an essay once, about what it meant, knowing his dad would drive 4 hours. He wrote, "He always made the distance feel like proof." She looked at her hands. She'll feel that. I didn't say anything. I looked out the window instead, because there are things that need a moment to settle before you can speak around them. Outside, Rhode Island was getting dark at the edges, the way New England does in November. Fast, like something decisive. A few lights coming on in houses near the tracks, the train moving through it all at a speed that made everything outside soft. He always made the distance feel like proof. South Station, Boston, 4:38 p.m. We stood on the platform in the rush of arrival, people with rolling bags, the exhaust and noise of a busy city station, and she had her winter coat buttoned correctly now, all the way up, and she looked steadier than she had at New Haven, which I thought probably had less to do with me than with 4 hours of talking and tea and the city that was home waiting on the other side of the doors. "Good luck with the play," she said. "Good luck with the essay kid in Austin," she smiled. "He'll be fine. He always lands." We stood there for a second in the particular way of people who have had a real conversation and are now at the edge of where it goes. She held out her hand. I shook it. "Thank you," she said, "for staying where you were." "It's what I do," I said. She looked at me for one more second, the look of someone filing something, the way you file a thing you want to remember specifically. Then she went through the doors into the city, and I went through after her, and the station swallowed us both up in the ordinary noise of a Wednesday afternoon. The play was a production of Our Town, which I did not look up beforehand, and am glad I didn't, because the thing about Our Town is that it's about exactly what the title promises: ordinary life, ordinary days, the specific weight of Tuesday and Thursday and the breakfast table and the walk to school. And what it argues, very quietly, over its 2 hours, is that the ordinary days are the whole thing. That we move through them not understanding that they're the thing, and then at some point we understand, and it's both too late and exactly the right time. My daughter played Emily. She was extraordinary. I am her father, so that's not objective, but it's also simply true. She stood at the center of that stage at the end of the second act, and she talked about ordinary mornings, sunflowers and food and coffee and new iron dresses, and there was not a sound in the house. I was in the 4th row. She didn't know which seat. When she came out for her curtain call, she found me in the crowd, the way kids find their parents across distances that shouldn't be findable, some instrument in them that works without explanation. She found me, and she held the look for exactly 1 second. That 1 second. I've waited 11 days in a river blind in a Montana snowstorm for a wolf that came on day 12 at 4 in the morning. I have waited in blinds and hides and cold water and high heat for the single image that makes the waiting worth it. Nothing has ever been worth it, the way that second was worth it. I didn't see Nina Vasquez again for 7 months. She found me the way people find each other now. A message through the photography website my assistant runs. 3 sentences, subject line blank. It said that her student's food truck in Austin had failed spectacularly, and he'd moved back to Boston with a new idea that was probably also going to fail spectacularly, and she'd decided she found this deeply funny, rather than exhausting, which she thought might be growth. The last line said, "The play was Our Town, wasn't it?" I wrote back, "How did you know?" She wrote, "Because you talked about your daughter the way George talks about Emily, before he knows. I teach this play every year. I recognized it. I sat with that for a while. Then I wrote, there's a farmer's market on Saturdays near the South End. I go when I'm in Boston. If you happen to be in that part of the city sometime," she wrote, "I know the one." She showed up the following Saturday at 9 a.m. in a green jacket and brought coffee she'd picked up on the way, which I mention only because she'd remembered that I drank it black, from a single sentence I'd said at the diner in New Haven 7 months earlier. I noticed. I didn't say anything about it. She noticed that I noticed. Some things don't need to be said to count. Buying the house turned out to be the easier part. Staying in it is in fact harder and ongoing, and requires the daily practice of not treating it like a place I'm passing through. Nina is patient with me in the specific way of a woman who has already learned, at some cost, the difference between someone who intends to stay and someone who does. My daughter calls her Ms. Vasquez, even though she doesn't have to anymore, which Nina says she prefers. She says it's clarifying. My daughter says she says things that are worth writing down, which is, from a 13-year-old, an extraordinary review. Last October, we were all on a train together, the 3 of us, the same New Haven to Boston line. And my daughter was doing homework, and Nina was reading. And somewhere around New Haven, the announcement came that we were delayed outside Providence. My daughter looked up. How long? Doesn't say yet. Nina said. My daughter looked at me, then at Nina, then back at her homework with the expression of a person who has decided something is fine. Nina caught my eye over her paperback. The train sat still. Outside the window, the track stretched ahead into the dark between stations, the particular darkness of a delay. The world paused at the exact moment you're in the middle of it, requiring nothing but that you stay where you are. I stayed where I was. Some things you practice until they become true. And then one morning, you're sitting on a stopped train in the dark, with a woman reading beside you, and your daughter doing homework across the aisle, and the announcement says the delay is 45 minutes, and you think, good, I have nowhere else I need to be.